carrying on our second message in Philippians this morning, and talking about what sincere love really looks like. And I was kind of reflecting on that this week, my experiences of that. And obviously I could go to the obvious example of the lady who has the matching ring to this set. But another example came to mind as well. I think of a friend I had, a bit of a mentor as a teenager. And but what came to mind actually is more an online thing. So I remember specifically not entering my birthday into Facebook when I signed up eons ago. Not that long ago, actually, when you think about it. But being a little uncomfortable putting my birthday into an online thing or whatever. And so I noticed, though, as soon as I got on, it's like it gives you that automatic reminder. If any of your friends' birthday comes up, it tells you right away. And people, send out birthday greetings and all this. And I just never quite got into that because I thought, I don't think I could do that with any kind of genuineness. Like, if a machine tells me, oh, it's so-and-so's birthday, and I go and I write happy, like, is that big deal? Like, is that a meaningful connection? So I just kind of skipped that. And I've noticed on my own Facebook page that I don't get happy birthdays on Facebook because no one's getting reminded about it except for one. So this guy I knew in my teenage years, a bit of a mentor, he pretty much every year without fail will send me a little happy birthday. And sometimes he's drug up a photo from when I was a teenager or something, and he'll send that to me. I'm not sure if that's a blessing or a curse at that point, but I get reminded of the battle that was acne at 14. But I do appreciate, it's like that's pretty meaningful actually, for whatever reason. Just that it's like he is, he's probably written himself a calendar or whatever. So it's whatever, he's got his own reminder or whatever, but for some reason that just kind of strikes a chord with me of just a simple act of very sincere love. There's nothing, complicated about it, and somehow that just kind of hits home for me each year. I think I think there's probably only one more sublime experience than being sincerely loved, and that is sincerely loving someone else when you get to give that away as well. But it's, I think, exceedingly rare for a lot of us, actually, to either be loved sincerely or to love someone very sincerely. I think our relationships, they get complicated over time, don't they? And even when we do have the sincere love of one spouse for another in a healthy marriage relationship, it's easy for that just kind of to be the background noise of your home. You take it for granted. But then other relationships remind you that you really oughtn't to. That relationships get complex over time. You form different associations with a person. It's like, well, I appreciate their goodwill toward me, but then there's this other thing that I remember, and it all gets a little muddied, doesn't it? And there's something, I think, pretty marvelous about that experience of just being able to say, yeah, this is just pure, unalloyed love for one person for another. And of course, as soon as we talk about love, I think in our Canadian culture, North American culture, we start thinking of romantic love. But this morning we're going to kind of go in a different direction, actually, because that's where Paul is going to take us. But he's still talking about something that's more than a feeling. You see, I love the little memes, the cat photos on the internet. Find someone who looks at you the way your dog looks at your dinner, right? And that's we use love in a lot of different ways, don't we, in our language? But Paul means something pretty specific with it this morning. But you'll remember last week we looked at why Paul was thankful for the Philippian church, and he had a lot of motivation for that. And really this morning is actually a kind of a continuation of that. And you can see that actually even in the first few verses we're going to look at. So we're going to pick up Philippians again. I know Phil read it for us earlier from the International Children's Bible, but I'm going to read it from the NIV just so we're all kind of thinking of at least what I've been studying this week as well. So we'll get on the same track there. But he begins by sort of referencing this thankfulness. He says, it's right for me to feel this way about all of you, to be thankful for you. He says, it's right since I have you in my heart, and whether I am in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Paul says it's right for me to be thankful about you because of the deep affection that I have for you. And that deep affection, he sees that, is not just his thing. He wants to pray it into the lives of others because he knows that kind of sincere love brings God glory. So let's dive into that passage this morning. And first we're going to look at Paul's love for the Philippians. That kind of comes up in verses 7 and 8. And we're going to see that it's sincere. It's pure. It's not sort of bespeckled by anything else. And so the first aspect of that comes out is says it comes from pure intentions. He says, it's right for me to feel this way about all of you since I have you in my heart. Now remember, I know we've talked about this loss, but I think it's always a good reminder. Again, we read love and heart and we think romance. Paul is talking about something else. He says, I have love for you in my heart, and for Paul, that's the center of his will. That's where he makes his decisions. That's the center of his whole being, not just his emotions, though emotions are going to come into it probably for us later. He's saying, at the end of the day, all of my choices are made with your best in mind. That's what he's talking about when he says, I have you in my heart. He's saying that my will is focused on doing you right and keeping that at the center of our relationship. But then he goes on and he talks about how this love is a relational thing. It's not just a choice, some cold, hard thing, but it's a relational thing that's happening for them. And this is, I mentioned last week, it's probably the best way to understand Paul's letter to the Philippians is actually to examine it from a literary standpoint. So often when we come to books in the New Testament, we want to know what's going on in the church. We want to know, what are the particular arguments that are taking place, or conflicts, or what time period is it taking place? What are the external circumstances? But one of the most helpful things to understand about the book of Philippians is actually the kind of letter it is. And so I mentioned last week that it's a letter of friendship, and that's helpful for us to understand because there's a lot of common features from letters of friendship at that time. And one of them is that you would talk at the beginning, you would spend some time talking about the commonality that you had. What's going on in my life? What I want to hear about what's going on in your life. And it was usual to mention, how I long to see you. That's why you sent a letter, right? Because you wouldn't be able to talk to the person. And so that was a very common expression. And so, of course, as we noted last week, Paul's going to use that form, but he's going to kind of bend it to his Christian purposes. And so he says, it's right for me to feel this way about you since I have you in my heart. And then he talks a bit about the relationship. He says, whether I am in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. We have a shared experience. That's what a relationship is sharing something like that, right? And Paul's, of course, as we said last week, he's writing from prison. So he's saying, whether I'm in chains or whether I'm defending and confirming the gospel, and those are legal terms, actually. So he says, whether I'm in a prison cell or in a courtroom, you all share in God's grace with me. And what is that grace? Well, it's not just, I don't think it's just salvation, though he's certainly including that in there. I think he's actually talking about the experience of standing up for Christ, of speaking the good news. And Paul says, you are sharing with me in that. I think both in the sense that they are doing the same thing in Philippi, but also in the sense that they are there present with him in his heart. He says, I have you in my heart. And so this is all God's grace together for us. We have this relationship where we get to share these things. It's those, Paul says, we're distant and yet we're co-workers. We're in the days of remote work, we're all kind of in our separate places of work, but we're all working together. And then finally he says, God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. There's a spiritual, there's an emotional layer to his love as well. That longing, he says, is expressed. It's an affection. It's a feeling. It's not just, it's not just a fact. It's not just the work that we have together, but he says, I love you, as we would say, from the bottom of my heart. There's an emotional connection for him there. I think interestingly, though, this is a letter written from a distance. And so he's saying, the distance has not actually quenched that longing, that affection. I think we would, in our day, say, well, if you really love somebody, you're going to go and see them, be with them face to face. But Paul's not gone and done that. This is a longing that he's enduring because of his greater love for Jesus Christ and his obedience to him. So there's all of that sort of subsumed under his obedience to Christ. This is Paul's love for the Philippians. And I think a good example for them, obviously, a good example for us as well, that there's, it's sincere, it's pure, it's holistic, but it's also kind of mission-driven too. He's not just going to run away to Philippi because he feels longing for these people. He has things and places to be, things to do and places to be. And of course, he's also in prison, so that kind of puts a damper on travel plans as well. Paul carries on, though. And interesting. I think he kind of calls back this prayer that he talked about in verse 4. He says, "In all my prayers for you, I always pray with joy." And now, actually, in verse 9, he's kind of giving us the content of what he prays, the text that he's praying, as it were. And so Paul prays for the Philippians, and what he's praying for is simply love. In a word, he's praying for love. But I think it's helpful for us, again, to sort of pay careful attention to what kind of love he's praying for, because as I said, we tend to think romantic love, and that's kind of the only thing. And Paul puts a very different spin on it. So first he says, "This is my prayer for you, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight." More and more. So there's something abundant about the love that he wants for them. Actually, that term more and more is kind of interesting how it's used outside of the New Testament. It's when you have more than enough of something, in the sense that it becomes useless. That it's, we would say superfluous. Like, why did you buy so many oranges when you went to the supermarket? We only needed 3, and the rest are going to rot. I remember my mother would tell me when she was expecting me. One time she came home from the grocery store, and she had a whole bag of oranges, like 5 pounds or something like that. And she's, of course, expecting, and so had been on a big shopping trip. And my dad came and was helping unload the groceries. He says, "Do you mind if I just sit down and have a little break here? I think I'm going to have a little snack, have an orange." And he says, "Yeah, sure, go for it." So Dad keeps unpacking. My mom ate the entire bag of oranges. So abundance can be a relative term, right? But what Paul is calling for is, enough love that any situation, there's always going to be some leftovers. No matter what circumstances you find yourself in, there's always going to be a bit more love. You're never going to find your tank empty. You're never going to find yourself running dry, he says, and I pray that kind of love for you. Now, Paul, as I said last week, is in these first few verses kind of setting us up for the rest of the book. And one of the things that's going to become abundantly clear as we go through Philippians is when we start reading about love for other people, Paul is usually talking about actually people inside the church. The Philippians, it's not like he's slapping up them on the wrist, but he is concerned that, fractures may be starting to form in that body of Christ. They need to be reminded to love each other more and more. And so I think in a lot of ways, that's often what we need to be reminded about returning to love for is for each other. Sometimes it's easy to love someone who you've just met. In some ways, you're unfamiliar with their foibles and their difficulties, and it's just sort of, a blank canvas. So you can love that person without really knowing them. Sometimes it's a little more challenging when we see them week after week after week, and they're still wearing that same ugly sweater or whatever, right? Like we know the lay of the land, and sometimes it's at that point that we need to dig deep and say, yeah, I still have more love to give to this person. But he says, he says that your love may abound more and more, but he says in a particular way. He says, in knowledge and depth of insight. Well, what does that mean, really? I think that's love that is wise in some sense, and our good Mr. Phil reminded us that that's wise in what way? About God, about His holiness, that our love would abound in the depths of insight into who God is, that our love would show that. The Old Testament word that's used over and over again to describe God's love for His people is hesed. And it basically means not just love, but kindness towards other people and faithfulness. That the things that God has said to His people, He's going to fulfill. And as we learn that ourselves, as we love that way ourselves, then we become more like Him. And our love abounds in knowledge and depth of insight because we're learning about who God is, and we're putting that into real practice. We're loving the way that He loves. Love that is wise, I think, is something that Jesus would commend us for as well. To be as gentle as doves, but wise as serpents. I think sometimes when we talk about love, somebody loving well, we sometimes picture somebody kind of naive. Willing to let people get away with things, willing to be a bit of a doormat. But Paul says, no, I want you to love, your love to abound more and more in knowledge and depths of insight. So I think on the one hand, it's a love that isn't naive, that doesn't realize the ramifications of what's going on, but I think it's also a love that isn't cynical, a love that's willing to sacrifice, a love that's willing to be mistreated if necessary. When I think about that kind of love, I kind of just picture somebody with their arms wide open in a resilient manner, knowing that sometimes love costs us something, and yet willing to love all the same. But he also says that it's a kind of love that sanctifies. He says, I pray that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Paul is always looking forward to that day when Jesus is coming back. And he says, I pray that in the meantime, that your love would be making you more and more like Jesus. That you'd be able to figure out what the best thing is. I think sometimes we're satisfied with figuring out good and bad. And even the International Children's Bible that Phil was reading from is like, that's kind of what it talks about, is telling the difference between good and bad. But actually what the text says is what is best. Figuring out what's not just good, but what's better and what's best. What's the best option for me at this point? I think that's where we struggle often. I think that's what wisdom is. There's 100 ways we could go in life, and some of them are immoral, some of them are bad, and we don't go that way. But then wisdom is trying to figure out what to do with all the other options. What is best? And so Paul says the way you're going to figure that out actually is through love. Through love, which sometimes we don't think about as maybe a directing pressure in our lives as Christians, but it ought to be. It ought to be, as God's love propels me forward, that should be pushing me towards what is best, not just for me, but for other people as well. And so sometimes, as I said, it's not a naive love. Sometimes we have to choose what is best when that is unpopular, when it doesn't, in the short term, make life easier for us. Think about that that's usually something that I think comes up a lot with parenting. We have to choose what is best for our children, even when, candy for dessert every night would, that might be nice. That might be enjoyed in the short term. We kind of discovered that this week with Arga, that you can only feed him a very little bit of the gingerbread house before that upsets his stomach. And yet, he'd be quite happy having, most of a floor or something like that, right? So what is not just good and enjoyable in the moment, but what is best? And Paul says, that's what I'm praying for you, is that you have the kind of love that has that sort of long-term vision to be able to propel you forward, not just for now, but into the future. And he says, so that you may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Finally, verse 11, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ. I'd never thought about the fact that Bob the tomato is a vegetable, and yet he headlines VeggieTales. That's going to be cause for reflection later this afternoon. But as Paul puts, it's not that kind of fruit. It's the fruit of righteousness. And so, of course, we could go to Galatians and look at self-control, peace, gentleness, kindness, goodness. But I think the reminder always with fruit is that it's something visible in our lives. It's not just, I think I'm doing better with this, but it's something that actually takes place. Thinking of New Year's resolutions, it's like I might think I'm doing better with the diet and eating, but the proof is always when I step on the scale, right? And that's kind of what Paul is saying, is like, as much as you might think you are abounding more in love and becoming wiser and being sanctified through God's love, the proof at the end of the day is the fruit. Is your life actually changed by it? And so my question for you this morning, I think, is simply, do you have the love of Christ in you? Do you have the love of Christ in you? Paul, of course, describes it in quite a good detail, I think, for the Philippian church and for us, what sincere love looks like. It's not just a feeling. For Paul, it's something that drives him forward in prayer and in mission for other people. Has somebody been praying for you in that way, that your love would abound more and more? Do you have people around you, maybe a grandmother? They're the usual suspects, praying that we'd become more godly people. But it's not just the province, I think, of older women. Do you have somebody that you're praying that for? That they would abound more in love, not just your kind of love, but the love that is in Jesus Christ, the kind of love that sanctifies, that makes wise. That's my challenge for us this morning, I guess, is to embrace that kind of love, to pray about it, work it into our lives like the yeast into the bread, and through prayer to work it into the lives of other people as well. I thought it fitting that this is just kind of how the calendar worked out. We're celebrating communion this morning as well. And I appreciate that, because it gives us time to kind of pause and reflect on the love of Christ. Sometimes I feel like sometimes as a preacher, I treat the love of Christ like a spiritual football, a means to an end. It's like I'm going to talk about it so that I can motivate people towards whatever. And I think it's good to just kind of pause and realize, no, actually, the love of Christ is something worthy of our attention in and of itself. Something worthy of us just pausing and reflecting on. That it's not just, sort of a bullet point on our theological statements that we keep on paper or in our heads or wherever, but that it's something worth appreciating. That God, as the verse said, so loved the world. You can go through a lot of texts, and actually John is probably the chief culprit for it, looking at how God talks about the world in Scripture. And it's, there's the meaning of just sort of the physical creation, this rock that's spinning around the sun with some water on it. There's also this sense of the world as just a very negative thing, especially in a lot of John's writing. It's something to be feared. It stands in opposition to the kingdom of God. And yet we have beautiful texts like John chapter 3, verse 16 that remind us the world is also people too. And it's people that Christ died for because he loved them so much. We're, of course, memorizing Romans, many of us this year, and so there's lots of good texts in there that we could go to. Think about God's love for us. Thinking about Romans 5, verse 8 this morning. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I think that is the unfortunate, Paul talks about a veil being over the eyes of the people of Israel when they hear the law spoken, that they don't really understand what it's about. I think there's a veil over our culture as well, that sometimes when they hear about the church or Jesus or even the gospel, somehow they hear it and think it's about, well, this is a bunch of people that think they're better than everyone else. And at the end of the day, it's know that we are all sinners, and yet Christ died for us. That's the good news, that we don't have to buck up, we don't have to start pulling at our bootstraps, but that we can just acknowledge that there's good news for us in God, in what Christ has done for us, in his unfailing love for us. I think that's the beauty of it. I referenced the Old Testament concept of hesed, of God's love expressed in covenant. And yet ultimately, at the end of the day, God's supreme act of love in sending Jesus Christ for us was not required by any covenant, by any agreement. There was no law that said he had to do it other than that law of love that's emblazoned in God's heart for us.